The snow hadn't stopped in 2 days. The cold wind moved down the slopes like breath from a sleeping god, carving through the trees and settling into the valley with a bitter finality. Up in those Wyoming hills, silence was something you could feel pressing against your chest, the kind that told you nobody was coming. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. Cedar smoke rose from a crooked chimney. The cabin looked like it had been slapped together by a man in a hurry and too proud to ask for help. Its walls were patched with pine slabs, elk hide, and hope. Inside, a fire popped. And on the floor, wrapped in a quilt too big for her, the girl hadn't moved in hours. Name? The man asked again, softer this time, and no answer. Just her eyes. Open now, watching the shadows move on the log walls. Blue-gray like ash that had been stepped in. He stood by the fire, massive hands clumsy with the small bowl he held. His name was Elijah Brooks, though no one had called him that in 5 winters. Folks in Laramie referred to him as the Hermit of Cottonwood Ridge. Kids whispered he ate wolves and carved his thoughts into bark. But the truth was simpler. He was a man who'd once tried his best for the world and had nothing to show for it but scars and silence. The girl had come 2 nights ago. More truthfully, she'd fallen 2 nights ago, right into his woodpile. Half conscious and barefoot in the snow, with a busted lip and dried blood on her temple. He'd seen the sack first. Burlap, tied at the neck, slipped halfway down her shoulders by the time he reached her. She'd cut it herself with a jagged rock, arms trembling, hands raw from rope burn. She hadn't said a word until now. "I'm not worth saving," she whispered. Elijah didn't blink. Just crouched and held out the bowl. "Soup's hot." She flinched when her fingers brushed his. Not from fear, he realized, but from shame. The kind you didn't earn. The kind somebody else gave you like a brand. "Don't need your pity," she muttered. But the bowl didn't leave her hands. He sat back on his haunches, resting his elbows on his knees. Watched her slurp like someone who hadn't tasted broth in weeks. Maybe longer. The wind howled outside. A shutter banged. Elijah didn't move. He stared at her. Torn skirt, cracked nails, no coat, and did the math in his head. No shoes. No horse. No tracks behind her in the snow, which meant someone left her up here to die. When the soup was gone, she leaned her head against the cabin wall and closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed. Not asleep, just no longer fighting to stay alive. That was the moment he got up and picked up his knife. Not to threaten her. He stepped outside, snow crunching under his boots, and made his way to the big spruce near the corral. It stood wide and still, like a witness, with slow, deliberate cuts. Elijah began carving her name. Or rather, a name. Because she hadn't given him one. She didn't seem ready. He carved anyway. 4 letters. Simple. Bold, June. Not because it was her name, but because maybe, someday, she'd want one that reminded her of something warm. When he came back inside, her eyes were open again. "You carve something?" she asked, voice thin. "Sometimes," he said, setting the knife down beside the hearth. Silence stretched between them like a sheet drawn over a body. She curled her legs under the quilt. And for the first time, Elijah noticed the bruises. Faint outlines of boots on her calves. Purple shadows around her wrists. Someone had held her down. Someone big. He poured himself a cup of black coffee and leaned against the wall, staring into the flames. "Was it a man?" he asked. She didn't answer, but her lip trembled. He didn't ask again. Instead, he said, "Up here, people don't find things unless they go looking. You were left somewhere on purpose." She nodded. Just once. He sipped the coffee, then added, "But you weren't supposed to live." That time, she looked at him, eyes sharp now, not frightened but searching, measuring the man who'd brought her inside instead of stepping over her. "Why'd you take me in?" Elijah didn't move. He thought of his sister, long buried, of a cabin fire, a child's grave, and a woman who once whispered she was too broken to be loved. He didn't answer the girl right away. Instead, he knelt by the stove, threw in more wood, and said, "Snow was falling. Fire was warm. You were still breathing." Then he looked at her and added something else, quieter. "Sometimes that's all it takes." The girl blinked hard and turned her face away. A full minute passed. Then, in a voice so small it could have been mistaken for the wind slipping through the cracks, she asked, "What did you carve?" Elijah stood again, walked to the door, and cracked it open. The cold rushed in like a ghost. Snow was still falling, thicker now that he pointed to the tree. "You'll see it when you're ready," he said. She didn't ask again, just pulled the quilt tighter around her shoulders. That night, as the fire dimmed and the snowstorm swallowed the valley, Elijah carved something else. Not into wood this time, but into memory. He remembered her voice. "I'm not worth saving," she said. He didn't agree, but he didn't argue either. Some things had to be shown, not said. Elijah woke before dawn. The snow had eased sometime in the night, leaving behind a pale hush across the valley. Smoke from the chimney rose straight and clean. No wind, no tracks. He slid on his boots and stepped outside, pausing at the carved spruce. His knife work was clean. June, cut deep and rough into the bark, like a promise made quietly to someone who didn't believe in promises. Back inside, the girl was still sleeping, curled tight by the hearth. She hadn't made a sound all night, not even when the logs popped. But her fingers were twitching in her sleep, like they were reaching for something that wasn't there. Elijah sat at the table, pouring himself coffee. He didn't touch the eggs he fried. He just watched the girl. June, he was calling her now, as she stirred beneath the quilt and slowly sat up. "You stayed?" she asked, surprised. "I live here," Elijah said. "You didn't." She paused, eyes scanning the door, the window, as if expecting him to be gone or replaced by someone worse. "I don't run out on folks," Elijah said simply. She nodded like she didn't believe him but didn't have the strength to argue later. That morning, she finally stood. Her legs shook under her. Elijah didn't move to help, just waited. Let her wobble to the wash basin. She scrubbed her face, then stared at her reflection in the dented tin mirror hanging above it. "I look like something a wolf coughed up," she muttered. He didn't answer. Instead, he tossed her a clean shirt, rough-spun flannel his, and pointed to the back room where his old bedroll was. She disappeared without another word. Word got out 2 days later. Elijah had taken the mule into town for supplies. Just oats, coffee, lamp oil, nothing worth talking about. But Laramie had eyes and tongues. He hadn't ridden in for a season, and now suddenly he was back, asking Doc Fields for powdered alum and liniment. Folks noticed that he heard the first whisper at the trading post, thought the old coot lived alone. Then again outside the saloon, saw blood on the back of his mule saddle. What do you think that means? By the time Elijah finished tying down the last sack of feed, the sheriff was already waiting for him at the edge of town. Sheriff Lane wasn't a bad man, just the kind who didn't like unknowns. "You bring someone back up that mountain?" he asked. Elijah didn't answer at first, just adjusted the rope on his saddle. "She in trouble?" Lane pressed. Elijah looked him square in the eyes. "She's breathing. Should I ask how she got up there?" "You could," Elijah said, "but I won't lie for comfort." That was the end of it, for the moment. But Elijah knew how these towns worked. Laramie didn't care about facts, it cared about types. And a girl showing up with bruises and no name didn't fit neatly into the good kind. By the time he got home, June was sitting on the porch, legs dangling, looking like she'd always been there. Her eyes narrowed when she saw his face. "Town. Bother you?" "Town noticed me," he said. "Do I need to leave?" He didn't answer, just pulled the sack of oats from the mule and carried it past her. "I can leave," she said again, louder, still nothing. She stood. "Don't treat me like I'm fragile, Mr. Brooks. I've been through worse than your silence." Elijah turned then. "You shouldn't have had to," he said. His voice cracked just a little. She blinked. All that fire in her chest suddenly collapsed into embers. She lowered her head, arms folded across her borrowed shirt. "I didn't steal anything," she said. "I didn't lie. But I believe you." June stared at him. He added, "But others might not. That's the trouble. They think I'm the kind of girl a man hides," she whispered. Elijah stared at the tree. "They're wrong," he said. A day later, the preacher came up the trail, Reverend Jonas White, 60, sharp eyes, sharper tongue. He came alone, but brought judgment enough for 10 men. Elijah saw him from 100 yards off and put the kettle on anyway. "Wasn't expecting company," Elijah said as the preacher dismounted. "I wasn't expecting rumors either," the man replied. Inside the cabin, June stayed seated, quiet as stone. The preacher looked her over with the soft disgust of a man who claimed to offer forgiveness, but only if it came wrapped in Sunday clothes. "I'm not here to accuse," Jonas said. "Just here to understand." She was left in the snow. Elijah said flatly. Jonas looked to June. "By who?" She said nothing. Jonas turned back to Elijah. You know what people say when a man hides a girl up in the mountains? Elijah didn't flinch. Let them come say it to me. The preacher's jaw tensed. I serve a God who forgives. But I also serve a community that protects its own. She is your own, Elijah said, voice low. She's not married, Jonas said coldly. She's not named. And she sure as hell isn't part of this town. June stood up. She's right here, she said. The preacher turned. And what are you? He asked, without venom. Just calculation. She held his stare, even as her hands trembled. I'm the reason you came up this hill, she said. That means I matter. Even if you don't like why. The preacher opened his mouth, then closed it. Looked to Elijah. You're making it hard for folks to stay quiet, he said. I'm not asking for silence, Elijah said. Just decency. The preacher didn't argue. He left with a warning, not spoken, but cleared by the end of the week. The town was talking louder. Something was coming. A reckoning. Elijah could feel it in the way the birds fled before nightfall. In the way June watched the tree with her name and kept asking if he had a plan. He didn't. Not yet. The storm didn't come with thunder. It came with silence. 3 riders appeared just after dusk, moving slow across the ridge. No torches, no sound, like ghosts too tired to haunt. June spotted them first from the loft window. She didn't cry out, just stiffened, dropped the spoon from her hand, and said softly, They found me. Elijah didn't ask who they were. He already knew. He'd seen enough in her eyes these past days, the kind of fear that didn't come from stories but from memories etched into the bone. He stepped outside, rifle cradled in the crook of his arm, not raised, not yet. The snow crunched under his boots, sharp and deliberate. The riders stopped 100 feet from the cabin, silhouetted against the pale sky. No one spoke. June came to stand beside him, barefoot again, like she didn't feel the cold. Elijah glanced down. Inside, he said, I'm not hiding. She whispered. He didn't argue. Didn't send her in. Just shifted his stance and waited. The lead rider finally moved. He nudged his horse forward a few paces, enough that the firelight from inside the cabin caught his face, gaunt. Eyes sunk deep. A jagged scar along his left cheek. Name's Roper, he said. Elijah said nothing. Looking for a girl, Roper added. Ran off with some things that didn't belong to her. June didn't flinch. Elijah's voice was quiet. What kind of things? Money. Horse. Little pride. Roper sneered. She didn't have a horse when I found her, Elijah said. And pride don't count unless a man had it to begin with. Roper's eyes narrowed. His companions stayed still, hands near their belts. She yours now, mountain man? Roper asked, mocking. You buy her, or she offer herself for firewood? June's lip curled, but Elijah lifted one hand gently, not silencing her, just holding space. She was left to die in the snow, Elijah said. If you're here to explain why, I'm listening. Roper chuckled. She's got a mouth on her, that one. Didn't like the deal we made. Thought she could just walk away. So yeah, we let her walk. Just picked the wrong hill. I picked the right one, June said suddenly, voice trembling but fierce. All 3 men turned toward her. I picked the only place I thought someone might not trade me back for a bag of flour. Elijah's hands tightened on the rifle. That Roper's horse shifted nervously under him. She's not your kin. Ain't your trouble. She's under my roof, Elijah said. That makes her mine to defend. Roper's smile faded. Maybe. You forgot how this works, Brooks. There's rules out here. Women don't run. They get taken back. Elijah stepped forward once, slow. Not for me. A long breath passed between them. Then Roper spat into the snow. Your kind always thinks he can fix something broken. You think carving her name on a tree makes her pure. No, Elijah said. It makes her seen. One of the other men reached for his belt. Not fast, just a threat. June stepped forward before Elijah could speak. I'm not going back with you, she said. You got no say, Roper replied. You ran from a trade. You ran from what you owed. She looked him dead in the eyes. I owed you nothing. You beat a girl, tied her like a mule, and left her to freeze. Careful, Roper growled. You had your chance, Elijah said. Roper leaned forward in his saddle. You're willing to die for her? Elijah didn't blink. Are you willing to die to get her back? The silence cracked something in the night. Somewhere far off, a wolf howled. The fire behind the cabin popped. The wind stirred a thin sheet of ice on the snowdrifts. Then, Hoofbeats, not the 3 men in front. Another set. From behind the ridge came 4 more riders. Not fast, not loud, just present, dark shapes against a bruised blue sky, weaving. Down the trail Elijah had cut himself over years of solitude. Roper turned his head, uneasy. "Friends of yours?" He muttered. "No," Elijah said. "Just decent men who hurt a girl might need standing for." It was Will Danner from the sawmill. Levi Rowe from the lower pasture. Even preacher Jonas White, his coat flapping open, rifle slung low but firm in his grip. Roper shifted in his saddle. Jonas called out, "Ain't your business anymore, boys. The girl's under care. She stole from us." The third rider snapped. "She was sold," June shouted, her voice cracking. "Sold like meat. And when I screamed too loud, they wrapped my face in a sack." Jonas' eyes turned to steel. "I rode up this hill once, not knowing who you were," he said to June. "Now I do. And I came back to stand beside you." Roper looked at the 7 riders. At June. At Elijah. Then he pulled his reins hard, spit again, and said, "She ain't worth all this." Elijah didn't reply. He just watched them turn. 3 horses carrying cowardice down the trail. The threat was gone. But June stayed rooted. Only when the last hoofbeat vanished into the trees did her knees buckle. Elijah caught her before she hit the snow. "I told you," she whispered through tears, her voice ragged. "I told you I wasn't worth saving." He didn't speak, just held her against his chest, slow and firm, as the others dismounted behind them, saying nothing, just giving space. And in that cold silence, Elijah stared at the spruce tree across the yard. The name was still there, cut deep, waiting for her to believe it. The snow began to melt a few days later, slow at first, beads forming on the cabin roof, then dripping steady into the hard-packed dirt. The air lost some of its bite. Ravens began calling again from the trees. The world was remembering it wasn't built for winter alone. Inside the cabin, June sat cross-legged on the floor, staring at the stitched tear in her sleeve. Elijah was, by the hearth, working a new handle onto a hunting knife. Neither of them spoke much these days. Not because there was nothing to say, but because too much had already been said in glances and silences. She was healing, though she'd never call it that. Her lip had scabbed. The bruises were fading. She no longer flinched at every sound outside the window. And in the mornings, she started tending the fire before Elijah could. That morning, as she gathered eggs from the coop, she saw tracks leading up from the ridge. Her first instinct was fear. The second was memory. But by the time she reached for the cabin door, the figure appeared, not on horseback, but on foot. It was Levi Rowe. He removed his hat when he saw her. His hair was black with sweat. He carried a sack in one hand and something wrapped in oilskin in the other. "Ma'am," he said gently. "I'm not a ma'am," she replied, then paused. "But thank you." He set the sack down. "Got a few supplies. Doc Field sent liniment and dried Rose's hips. Said you'd need him more than he did." June lowered her eyes. "I'm not sick." Levi shook his head. "Didn't say you were." She looked at the oilskin. "And that?" He held it out. June took it slowly and unwrapped it. Inside was a leather-bound book, worn but sturdy. The spine cracked slightly. As she opened it, he said, Levi mumbled, "When you're ready, to write your name in it." She looked up. Whose idea was that? Elijah's. June held the book tight to her chest and nodded, just once. "Thank him," she said. "But tell him I'm not ready yet." Levi smiled kindly, turned, and headed back down the hill. That night, June sat by the fire, holding the book on her lap. Elijah didn't speak. She didn't open it. But she ran her fingers along the edge and whispered, "I don't remember what it used to be." Elijah looked over. "What? My name. My real one. I think they beat it out of me." She swallowed. It was like something I carried in my teeth. Then one day, I opened my mouth to scream, and it was gone. Elijah nodded. Slowly. "That happens." "You think that's weak?" she asked. "No. You ever forget something that mattered?" He looked into the fire, his eyes dark. "My wife's voice," he said. June waited. "She died years ago," Elijah said. "There's a moment every morning when I wake up, and I try to hear her say my name. But it never comes. I remember her face, her walk, even the way she hated beets." He smiled faintly. "But not her voice." June looked down at the firewood stacked neatly by the hearth. "She would have liked you," Elijah added. I don't know who I am yet, June said. You're here. That's a start. She exhaled hard through her nose and then did something she hadn't done since she arrived. She laughed. It wasn't loud and it wasn't long, but it felt like someone had opened a window in the cabin. The next morning, Elijah caught her with his knife in hand. She was standing in front of the spruce, eyes narrowed in focus, tracing over the name he'd carved weeks ago. She wasn't cutting over it, just outlining the letters deeper, like she wanted them to last longer. When she turned and saw him, she froze. I wasn't. I didn't want to. It's yours now, he said gently. She nodded. I still don't know if I'm worth saving, she whispered. Elijah stepped beside her. That's not your job to know. She blinked up at him. He pointed to the tree. That's my job. Later that day, she followed him to the ridge. The two of them worked quietly, repairing the broken fence line, hauling wood down to the creek, fixing the door to the smokehouse. She didn't ask where he learned to live like this, and he didn't ask what she used to be before she was afraid. But sometime after midday, as they sat with their backs to a rock, sharing cold jerky in silence, she asked, What happens now? You stay as long as you want, Elijah said. And if I leave? Then you leave. She turned to him. You just let me go? You're not something to keep, June. That name again. It didn't sting this time. She folded her arms over her knees and looked at the horizon. I think I'll stay until I know how to leave right, she said. Elijah nodded once. Fair enough. That night, after she fell asleep, Elijah stepped outside. He stood beneath the stars and looked up at the spruce. Snow had melted from its limbs, revealing dark needles and bark the color of gunmetal. The name shone faintly in the moonlight. He reached out, ran his fingers over it. Then, without thinking, he carved something else just below it. Not words, just a line, like a second root growing underneath the name. She wouldn't see it for a while, but someday, when she did, she'd know. Someone had made space for her long before she believed she belonged. 3 years later, the tree was still there. The bark had healed in places, curling around the carved letters like skin remembering a wound. Snow had come and gone 27 times since Elijah cut her name into it. Storms had passed. Coyotes had howled and vanished. But the name stayed. June, and beneath it, still faint but deeper now, a line. Not a name, not a date, just a mark, a witness. The cabin had changed too. The porch had been rebuilt, twice. New shutters now hung square on their hinges. The roof didn't leak anymore, not even when spring melted fast and heavy. A second chair had been added beside the door, always left empty when one of them was out, and inside, a table sat between two shelves lined with books. One book always stayed open, the one Levi Rowe brought. Pages now filled with handwriting, both sharp and graceful. Some were lists, seed orders, chores. Some were memories. Some were things she was scared to say aloud. Her name, June, was written on the first page, not once, but many times, sometimes small, sometimes large, sometimes shaky, but never crossed out. Elijah still lived there too, same as ever. But he moved slower now. His left hand sometimes trembled when it held his coffee, and he no longer hauled both water barrels without stopping to catch his breath. And June, she no longer slept curled up in the corner. She rose early, boiled water, braided her hair without shaking. Her voice had changed too. It wasn't louder, just steadier. It no longer asked for permission. One morning, as they shared bread and boiled eggs, June set her mug down and said, I want to ride into Laramie. Elijah looked up. You sure? She nodded. I want to see who I used to be, and tell her she didn't lose. He didn't say no. He just packed her a tin of biscuits, handed her the mare he'd trained himself, and said, Come back if you want to. She rode off slow. No hurry. No fear. By the time she returned 3 days later, she didn't speak of what she saw. But that night, she sat by the fire and read out loud from a letter she'd written, not to anyone in particular, just the girl who'd once staggered through a snowfield and collapsed in a stranger's woodpile. I used to think silence meant strength, she read. Now I know it can also mean no one listened. But someone did. And because he did, I learned how to listen back to my bones, my breath, my name. Elijah didn't look at her while she read, but when she finished, he handed her the knife. You carve it, he said. Your words, not mine. So she did. The next morning, She carved under her name. Gently, carefully, she stayed. That summer, children started coming by. First, just the Rowe girl, who'd lost her mother in childbirth and liked to sit beside June while she boiled lye soap. Then two brothers from out near Cottonwood, whose father drank too hard and too loud. June let them sleep in the barn, made them eggs, and taught the older one how to mend boots. Word spread slow, as it does in places where dignity still costs something. Soon, June was known not just by her name, but by what she gave: warmth, patience, a place to sit without being asked what you'd done wrong. That be why the second winter, she and Elijah had built another room onto the cabin. She never called it a school, but children learned there, and when they left, they always carved their names into the back fence. Not big, just enough. One afternoon, as Elijah watched a boy cut careful letters into the wood, he turned to June and said, "You ever think about leaving here?" She shook her head slowly. "I did once," she said, "but the road out felt smaller than the one I made right here." He nodded, and that was that. Elijah died in his sleep the following spring. No warning, no pain, just a quiet breath and a stillness that never moved again. June buried him beside the spruce tree. She carved his name into the other side of the trunk. No sermons, no preacher, just her hands, shaking a little, pressing each letter in. Elijah Brooks. Then, underneath, she carved one more thing. He listened. Years later, the cabin still stood. Weeds crept around the fence. Children became men. Women who had once come with broken arms returned with their own daughters, holding them close. And on the spruce, for words remained. One was her name. Two were his, and one was the truth they built together. Without asking permission from a world that had once tried to silence them both, she stayed. He listened. Sometimes, that's all a person needs.